This video is the first in a series about the arts of Asia, so we'll be starting off with the Indus Valley, but before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few key ideas about what there is to gain for studying the arts of Asia. So first of all is a new perception of your own culture and appreciation of that of others, a heightened understanding of the role art can play in society, and a better understanding of how reality can be defined and organized. So many of us are familiar with the traditions of Western art, ideas of linear perspective, and the kind of iconography we tend to see in Western art. However, we'll see very different types of iconography and ways to organize space and to tell narratives or to tell stories in the arts of Asia. So let's begin that exploration, and as I mentioned, we'll start off with the Indus Valley. So we move on to this particular area, South Asia, or what's known as the subcontinent. Zooming in on the Indus Valley, you can see it's outlined here, very lush area, easy for farming, or easier than some areas. We'll be focusing in on two cultures, primarily Mohenjo Daro, but also looking at one example of art from Harappa, and the whole culture is often called Harappan. So you may hear that as well. In addition to just being called Indus Valley, you may encounter the term the Harappan culture. The mature period of this culture runs from about 2500 to 1900 BCE, but I have it at 3000 to 1900 because you really do start to see a lot of these settlements very early on, and there's over a thousand settlements that have been discovered along the Indus River, which is this great river that runs from many rivers extending down from the Himalayas to form this massive waterway that then extends down into the Arabian Sea. So the Indus River, there's just another image and another map, again, to orient you. It's in modern-day Pakistan, so we can see that here. And of course, you should be familiar with other river cultures, the most famous probably being Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and then of course the Nile culture, the Egyptian culture around the Nile. But of course we also have the Yellow River in China, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So Mohenjo-Daro, the city that we'll be focusing on primarily regarding or connected to the Indus Valley, was a very organized city. We see a nice grid system in place. We see standardized bricks indicating that there was some kind of central control and some kind of central production in terms of the kinds of structures that were being built and the kind of materials that were being used. Scholars often talk about how hygienic it was compared to other cultures, because you can see that there were sewage systems, thus to drain this kind of human waste away from places where you lived. So looking at this culture, you can see that it was highly organized, pretty densely populated, and that you did seem to have some kind of overarching governmental system. But what we don't find in Mohenjo-Daro are large palaces or indications of very large ceremonial or ritual centers. We do, however, have this one great bath, which we'll talk about in just a minute, that seem to indicate some kind of ritual, but it's still something that scholars are debating about and trying to figure out exactly how that functioned. This image here, of course, is an artist's reconstruction of what Mohenjo-Daro may have looked like, just to give you a sense of what the city would have looked like thousands of years ago. And this is a plan of the city to give you a sense of the overall grid structure or grid plan of the city. Things that have been discovered in burials include jewelry, indicating that great time and care was taken in burying the dead. However, as this civilization comes to decline, we'll start to see much more people who were very speedily buried, because they seem to have been more in a rush, especially if there was some kind of invasion or infighting within these cities. Of course, there wouldn't have been as much care and as many objects buried with the dead. But here are just some images to give you a sense of some of the objects that have been discovered. Here's a view of Mohenjo-Daro as it looks today to give you a sense of those regularized bricks, how structures were created, the small rooms within buildings. There were houses, private houses within this particular city. There are these structures that have been called citadels, so these elevated areas in the city. This gives a sense of something that would have been a protective feature for the city. We do see walls around these cities. However, there are very few weapons that have been discovered, or very limited weapons, so we tend to think of this society as less involved in warfare than we see in a lot of other societies. So very limited warfare early on during the high point of this civilization. So these elevated structures could have been used for ritual purposes or for religious religious purposes. There was a stupa added later on, which is a Buddhist structure, and we'll talk about that and the symbolism of the stupa in a later lecture. Again, we see baked bricks and the idea that the bricks were standardized. So one of the first key work that we'll cover is the Great Bath. So this is a very important structure that was sealed so that the water could not drain out. And it seems to connect to ideas of cleanliness or purity that we also see later on in Hinduism. So we see these kind of ritual baths later on in Hinduism. So a lot of scholars want to connect this to a possible early practice, this idea of originating an idea of cleanliness when practicing a certain ritual. We do not think that it was just a swimming pool or something where people hung out to bathe, because it is in such an important area of the city and because it is so large. We do believe that it was for ritual purposes, but again, research is still being conducted on that, and we still are looking for more answers as to exactly how this was used. There's just another view, so you can see it from a different angle, and then here is a reconstruction of how the bath would have looked. It would have had a colonnade, or at least supports around, with a kind of portico, and then a central open area where individuals could have gone into the bath. And again, we believe this was probably for ritual or religious purposes, not just for recreational. So one of our first sculptures to examine is the so-called priest king, although some people believe this figure to be more of a shaman or an ancestor figure, but he's clearly an individual of status. He has a kind of band around his forehead, looking almost like a diadem or a kind of crown. His beard is marked by this kind of stylization, these vertical lines, indicating wisdom and experience. His facial features are very large, so that kind of draws us in to look more closely. His eyes would have probably been inlaid with shell or some kind of inlay. His very nice garment, he has this garment that runs across one shoulder, and underneath the arm of the other. So on the other side, you can see that there's a kind of patterning running across this garment, which would have been, of course, very expensive and very beautiful. It's important to remember that textiles were incredibly expensive in the ancient world. We live in a world where textiles tend to be very inexpensive, but for someone to have something with this much decoration, with this kind of trefoil design, so I've just noted that as trefoil, which is a three-lobe design, and as I mentioned, originally probably would have had a colorful inlay within these areas here. Obviously, there is some damage. Originally, this figure may have been in a kneeling position. There are other male figures that have been discovered that look similar to this priest king who are kneeling, so it could be some kind of ritual or offering. So we don't think that this is a god, because we assume he may have been in this kneeling position. He also has jewelry, of course, around his arm, and just to clarify, this is the front of the figure and this is the back of the figure. The fact that his eyes are kind of semi-squinted could perhaps indicate more of a shaman or someone who's connecting to the divine, but that's just one possible theory that has been put forth about this figure. In addition to the priest king figures, or these figures that might be ancestors or shaman that we just saw, we also have a figure of a mother goddess, and there are actually quite a few of these that have been discovered in the Indus Valley. So this one's from Mohenjo Daro, relatively small, about 4 inches, but she's a great precursor to the kind of fertility figures that we tend to see in India a little bit later on, figures that are called the yakshi. So we'll talk about those in a later lecture. So this figure of the mother goddess, you can see both her breasts and her hips are exaggerated. She has very elaborate kind of jewelry or body adornment, similar to what we saw in the other figure. So when we were looking at some of the real jewelry earlier, you can now actually see it on the sculptures of the priest king, and then also here on the mother goddess. So you can see a necklace with a pendant in the middle between her breasts. You also see a necklace here, a choker, and then also a kind of headdress. She may have had an even more elaborate headdress that has obviously kind of broken off. These figures are somewhat rudimentary, but indicate a kind of interest or worship or reverence to this type of mother goddess figure, who clearly is identified by her very female characteristics, those wide hips, the breasts, things that we associate with maternal figures, and kind of an exaggerated femininity. And of course, if you're familiar with some of the mother goddess figures in Paleolithic Europe, this creates a nice kind of parallel to what's going on in cultures in other areas. All right. A more unusual figure who doesn't seem to demonstrate those kind of exaggerated physical characteristics is the dancing girl, or sometimes called the courtesan. And this particular figure doesn't seem to be a kind of goddess figure. She seems more like a kind of girl you might have encountered in the Indus Valley because her body is less exaggerated, but she does have extensive body adornment. So those bangles along her arm go all the way from the top of the arm all the way down to the bottom. She has a few bangles on this side. She has a necklace. So again, this interest in body adornment seems to be shown in a lot of the artworks that we see, and then also in the objects in the burials. But she also has a nice rhythm to her representation. It's made out of bronze, so made out of metal, a more expensive material than the terracotta or baked clay that we just saw. So clearly this must have been an important figure, but there still are a lot of theories about it, but it's just a really striking work of art, just in the sense of motion and dancing, the jewelry that she wears. Again, it gives us some nice hints about life in the Indus Valley. So I also want to cover some of the seals that have been discovered associated with the Indus Valley. We see a lot of bulls on these seals. Some people have thought some of them with what looks like a single horn look like unicorns, which I'll show you in a second. And then there are also some interesting male figures in yogic postures. So we'll look at that also in just a minute. But these seals were carved on relatively soft stones and then covered with a kind of coating and then fired to harden them. And they include images of bulls, for example, that may have been symbols of virility, but also writing. So some people have theorized that the Indus Valley had some of the earliest writing in the world. And so the sad thing is we have yet to determine how to read this script. We do know that it was written, or that it was read, excuse me, from right to left. But beyond that, there's very little that we know about it. There are a couple of theories whether the symbols indicate certain words, that each one is a certain word. Some people think that it's an Indo-European language connecting it to northern India, while other people believe it's more of a Dravidian language or connected to southern India, because some people have theorized that people from the Indus Valley eventually migrated down to southern India. This is again hotly contested. There's some research that seems to connect it more to the South Indian tradition, and there's a playlist that includes a talk that supports that theory. So my playlist for Indus Valley, you can refer to that. But again, this is something that people should continue to research, and hopefully one day we will discover what this text means. These seals were used to mark goods, so people could mark their personal identity with these particular stamps or seals. Here's a seal with a bull. This is the one with the single horn that some people have called the unicorn. Again, you can see that script running from right to left, and how you could use this like a stamp, again, to mark goods or belongings. Here's one where you actually see an imprint of that seal showing an elephant. This is the most famous of the seals. This is a square stamp seal with seated figure and yogic posture. Some people have called this a proto-Shiva. Some people have talked about it including some Buddhist symbolism. And so let's go through some of the different interpretations. So looking at this figure, it has 3 faces, 1, 2, 3. So that's one interpretation, which connects it nicely to Shiva, because we tend to see those multiple faces in some representations of Shiva from Hinduism later on. But some people have just called it a lord of animals, or some kind of person who is in charge of animals, because you have a water buffalo, you have a rhinoceros, you have a tiger, you have an elephant, all surrounding this clearly very powerful figure in this yogic posture. Many scholars have tried to identify exactly what yogic posture he is in. He has an elaborate headdress, again connecting him to the animals, but also this idea of power with the headdress. And we know that the Indus Valley traded with Mesopotamia, and horned headdresses were symbols of divinity and power in the Near East. And so you may have that same kind of idea here. Again, we have writing along the top, however, we have not deciphered it. He's, again, a figure of status seated on a kind of throne, so on this elevated platform. And then also there seem to be deer figures right underneath his platform. And that connects him nicely to the Buddha, because there's a tradition that, or there's the idea that the Buddha gave his first sermon in a deer park. So we often see representations of the Buddha with the deer underneath him or nearby. So the deer is often connected to the Buddha. So a mystery of a seal, but possibly an indication of future religious iconography to come. A final work to look at is just this nude male torso from Harappa. We've been primarily looking at works from Mohenjo Daro, but here we see a work very small, 3.5 inches, made of red limestone, and it's incredibly naturalistic. You have that soft belly, you have a very fleshy representation here. Some people have even believed that it doesn't date from the Indus culture just because it looked so realistic. So I give you this term naturalism, the depiction of things as accurately as possible, because in this particular work you do tend to see, or you do seem to see, this very naturalistic human form. Some people have also thought that this suggests the practice of yoga in the Indus Valley because of the idea of the control of the breath and getting that breath into the belly. So both that previous seal, if we could return to it, which possibly shows the practice of yoga, and Shiva is even connected to the practice of yoga too, and this idea of breathing or drawing the breath into the belly also connects to this idea of yoga. So some people have said the Indus Valley was this idyllic, hygienic, peaceful society where people were practicing yoga, and these two works of art possibly support that theory. So finishing up around 1900 BCE, we start to see this decline of the Indus Valley civilization. One theory is there was an Aryan invasion from the west, and so these people were displaced and thus moved down to South India. However, the Aryans probably didn't come until a little bit later, so that could be a problem with that first theory. There may have also been an earthquake that changed the course of the river or caused it to become heavily silted, and so this made it difficult to farm. There's also the idea of heavy deforestation because of the production of all these bricks in order to build these cities. So again, that idea of kind of destroying one society by overdevelopment or by overly destroying your environment. Anyways, so possible crop failure or possible invasion, but we do see an increase in violence in the society around 1900 or 1800 BCE. So we definitely see that there is a decline, but we'll pick back up with the society a couple hundred years later.